Iron Trotha boats drifted silently through the darkness. Of young soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder gripping wet rifles as cold waves struck the wooden holes beneath them. Some were barely old enough to shave. Many believed the battle ahead would be quick, glorious, even heroic. But as dawn slowly revealed the cliffs of Gallipoli, they realized something was terribly wrong. Above them stood steep hills filled with hidden Ottoman defenders. Then the machine guns opened fire. Within hours, the beaches became fields of blood, and chaos. Entire units vanished before reaching the shoremen, drowned beneath the weight of their own equipment, while others crawled across sand, stained red by the sea. What was supposed to be a fast victory became one of the deadliest disasters of the First World War. But Gallipoli was more than a battle. It became the birthplace of the ANZAC identity for Australia and New Zealand, and the rise of a commander named Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who would later build modern Turkey from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. Tonight, we travel back to 1915 to the cliffs, trenches, and beaches of the Gallipoli Campaign, a place where empires collapsed and nations were born. Welcome to History Ledger. In the spring of 1915, the world was already drowning in mud smoke inside Europe. The First World War had frozen into a nightmare of trenches. From the cold fields of France to the forests of Eastern Europe, millions of soldiers sat trapped behind barbed wire, unable to move forward and unable to escape. Generals promised victory every month, yet the maps barely changed. So the Allies searched for another way. Far from the Western Front beyond the Mediterranean, there was a narrow strip of water known as the Dardanelles. Whoever controlled it controlled the gateway between Europe and Asia. Beyond those waters stood Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, one of the oldest empires in the world. British leaders believed the empire was weak, fragile, and ready to collapse if Allied warships could force their way through the strait. They could knock the Ottomans out of the war, reopen supply lines to Russia, and perhaps end the conflict entirely. On paper, it looked simple, but wars drawn on paper rarely survived the shoreline. Our first attacks came from the sea. Battleships pushed toward the Dardanelles, while naval guns thundered against Ottoman forts along the cliff. Smoke rolled across the water as sailors believed the defenses would break within days. Instead, hidden mines tore through the ship's massive warships, sank beneath the cold water, while survivors clawed through burning oil and debris. The naval assault collapsed in chaos, and suddenly the Allies faced a terrible decision. If the fleet could not force the strait alone, soldiers would have to capture it by land. So thousands of young men were gathered from across the empire: British regulars, French colonial troops, and volunteers from distant corners of the world. Young men from Australia and New Zealand who had never seen Europe and never seen the Ottoman Empire, and in many cases had never even left their hometowns before the war. Many believed they were sailing toward adventurous road, cheerful letters home describing the sea, the sunsets, and the excitement. Aboard crowded troop ships, officers spoke confidently of quick victory, while newspapers painted the operation as bold and glorious. Few understood what waited ahead. At dawn on April 25th, 1915, the invasion began. Sea was dark and unnaturally quiet as landing boats drifted toward the Gallipoli coastline. During the early morning hours of the Gallipoli Campaign, soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder in silence, rifles clutched tightly while listening to the sound of waves striking wood. Then the cliffs appeared. Ridges rose directly from the shoreline like walls of stone. Thick scrub covered the hills above, hiding Ottoman trenches and machine gun nests, invisible in the darkness. The landing had already gone. Wrong currents had pushed many boats far north of their intended beaches. You became separated before they even touched land, while officers struggled to understand where they were. Then came the gunfire. Rifles flashed from the cliffs above. Machine guns opened fire into the crowded boats. Men fell before reaching the shore. Some drowned beneath the weight of their equipment, while others staggered through shallow waters stained red with blood. Clawed their way onto narrow beaches littered with bodies, broken gear, and shattered boats. The invasion turned into chaos within minutes. There was almost nowhere to hide. Above them, Ottoman defenders held the high ground. Every climb exposed soldiers to gunfire from unseen positions among the ridges. Entire groups disappeared into clouds of dust and bullets before reaching the first hill. Still, the troops kept moving. Small groups pushed upward through ravines, and scrub, exhausted and disoriented, fighting not only the enemy but the landscape itself. Maps proved useless. Commands vanished and the noise units mixed together in confusion. By midday, the beaches had become overcrowded. Killing grounds, wounded men cried out beside the water while stretcher bearers searched desperately for paths through the gunfire ships. Offshore continued unloading more soldiers into the disaster, believing breakthroughs were still possible. The quick victory the Allies imagined was already dying on the sand, and somewhere above those cliffs, Ottoman officers watched carefully as the invaders struggled. Among them was a commander named Mustafa Kemal. The campaign ended. His decisions would change the fate of Gallipoli and the future of an entire nation. By the evening of April 25, 1915, the invasion had not become the swift triumph Allied commanders promised it. The narrow coastline of the Gallipoli Peninsula, exhausted soldiers dug desperately into dry earth with shovels, bayonets, and even bare hands. There was little time to build proper defenses. Ottoman rifle fire swept constantly across the ridges above them, and every movement in daylight risked death. The beaches below were crowded with wounded men, shattered supplies, and bodies still waiting to be buried. The smell of smoke mixed with blood and seawater, and above the chaos, the Ottoman defenders held the height. The soldiers of the Gallipoli Campaign, the battlefield itself, had become an enema. The cliffs were steep, unforgiving, and cut by deep ravines covered in thorny scrub that tore uniforms and slowed every advance. Struggled to read maps that no longer matched reality, while entire units became lost among the ridges. But while Allied commanders hesitated, one Ottoman officer moved quickly. His name was Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. At the time, he was not yet the founder of modern Turkey. He was simply a determined commander who understood one critical truth: the invaders could not be allowed to capture the high ground without waiting for permission from superiors. Mustafa Kemal pushed his troops toward the front lines as retreating Ottoman soldiers passed him. Some reported they had run out of ammunition. Kemal reportedly answered with chilling, "I do not order you to attack, I order you to die." The word spread quickly among Ottoman defenders, and they obeyed. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops surged into the hills, slowing the Allied advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. What had begun as a dangerous landing was now becoming a full stalemate within days. Gallipoli transformed into trench war. Trenches were primitive at first, shallow cuts carved into hard soil beneath relentless shellfire. In some places, opposing trenches stood only meters apart. Soldiers could hear each other coughing at night. Sometimes they shouted insults across the line. Sometimes they exchanged cigarettes during temporary truces to collect the dead. Then the shooting would begin. Again, every hill carried a name that soon became infamous: Lone Pintha, Nikunik, Purakip. Hellas, places that had once been empty stretches of rock and scrub, became symbols of terror. Conditions grew worse. With every passing week, some air arrived brutally across the peninsula. The heat was suffocating, and water became scarce. Corpses, buried in shallow graves or left exposed beneath the sun, attracted swarms of flies so thick that soldiers described black clouds hovering over the trenches. Disease spread everywhere. Dysentery weakened entire battalions, while men collapsed from dehydration and infection before even reaching combat. Medical stations overflowed with wounded soldiers waiting for evacuation ships that often arrived too late. Yet the fighting never stopped. Artillery thundered day and night across the cliffs, while snipers hid among rocks overlooking the beaches below. Soldiers learned to move carefully, keeping their heads low, because even a second of carelessness could bring sudden death. Still, commanders on both sides continued ordering assaults again and again. Men climbed from trenches and charged into machine gun fire at Lone Pine. Australian troops stormed Ottoman trenches in brutal hand-to-hand combat, fought with bayonets, rifle butts, grenades, and shovels. The fighting became so close and violent that some survivors later struggled to describe each. Tunic Bear New Zealand troops briefly captured vital high ground after horrific losses, but Ottoman counterattacks crashed into their exhausted lines until the summit became covered with dead from both armies. Neither side could truly win, but neither side could lead. Offshore, Allied warships still floated in the Mediterranean, their guns flashing against the coastline. Yet even their enormous firepower could not break the Ottoman defenses hidden among the ridges. Late summer, many soldiers understood the terrible truth: the campaign was failing. Home changed, and tonally excitement disappeared, replaced by exhaustion and grief. Some soldiers wrote about friends buried beside unnamed hills, while others admitted openly that they no longer believed victory was possible. They remained trapped on Gallipoli month After a month waiting in trenches, filled with mud, disease, fear, and death, and while the Allies slowly bled strength across the peninsula, the Ottoman defense was becoming something larger than a military victory. Many Turks, Gallipoli was becoming a symbol of survival itself. At the center of that resistance stood Mustafa Kemal, a commander, whose name would soon echo far beyond the battlefield cliffs overlooking the sea. By the winter of 1915, the dream of victory at Gallipoli was collapsing. 4 months Allied commanders had promised breakthroughs that never came. Thousands of soldiers had died fighting for ridges, trenches, and narrow stretches of coastline that gained almost nothing. The cliffs of Gallipoli had consumed entire battalions, and still the Ottoman defenses remained unbroken. Rain began to fall across the peninsula. Then came the cold, the same trenches that had baked beneath the brutal summer sun. Now flooded with icy water, soldiers wrapped themselves in damp blankets, while freezing winds swept across the hills from the sea. Frost-covered rifles during the night. Men already weakened by disease and exhaustion began dying from exposure, and still the war continued. Far away in London, confidence in the campaign had shattered. Leaders argued bitterly over the disaster unfolding at the Gallipoli Campaign. Casualty lists kept growing while ships continued arriving, filled with wounded soldiers missing limbs, eyesight, or hope. The operation that was supposed to end the war quickly had become one of the greatest failures of the First World War. Finally, the order came. The Allies would leave Gallipoli, but escaping the peninsula carried enormous danger. Ottoman guns overlooked the beaches, and a chaotic retreat could easily become a massacre. The defenders realized the evacuation was happening to early thousands. More men might die, trapped against the shoreline, so the withdrawal began in silence. At night, soldiers quietly removed supplies from the trenches. Horses and artillery were transported toward the beaches under darkness. Fears were carefully controlled. Even footsteps became dangerous. Sons to fool Ottoman observers. Allied troops created strange devices that allowed rifles to fire automatically after soldiers had already left their positions. Empty trenches continued shooting into the darkness, creating the illusion that the lines were still occupied. Then one by one, the soldiers disappeared into the night. December 1915 and January 1916, tens of thousands of Allied troops were evacuated from Gallipoli by sea. Against all expectations, the withdrawal succeeded with remarkably few casualties. It was perhaps the only truly successful operation of the entire campaign. When Ottoman troops finally entered the abandoned trenches, they discovered empty camps, scattered equipment, and silence where months of violence had once thundered. Across the hills, the battle was over, but Gallipoli would never truly end. More than 100,000 men had been killed or wounded during the campaign. Entire communities across Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, France, and the Ottoman Empire mourned sons who would never return home. For Britain, Gallipoli became a symbol of failed leadership and catastrophic planning, but for others the meaning became something far deeper. Before Gallipoli, many Australians and New Zealanders still saw themselves mainly as distant parts of the British Empire. They fought under British command, carrying British traditions and serving a king who lived half a world away. Yet the horrors of Gallipoli changed how they saw themselves. Courage, sacrifice, and suffering of the ANZAC soldiers became woven into national memory. Survivors returned home, carrying stories of impossible cliffs, shattered friendships, and endurance. Beneath constant fire across both nations, Gallipoli slowly transformed into the emotional beginning of a distinct national identity. Every year afterward, ANZAC Day would remember the men who landed on those beaches before dawn, not because they won, but because they endured. And on the other side of the battlefield, another nation was also being born. For the Turks, Gallipoli was remembered not as defeat but survival. Ottoman Empire itself was already weakening, exhausted by war and internal collapse. At Gallipoli, Ottoman soldiers had defended their homeland against some of the most powerful armies on earth. At the center of that victory stood Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. His leadership during the campaign made him a national heroine. The years after the First World War, as the Ottoman Empire finally crumbled, Mustafa Kemal would lead the struggle that created modern Turkey itself. And so Gallipoli became more than a battlefield. It became a place where empires bled themselves dry and new identities rose from the ruins. Even today, the cliffs still stand above the sea. The trenches remain carved into the hillside sand. Beneath the soil of Gallipoli lie others of soldiers from distant nations who never returned home. Young men who arrived believing the war would be short, glorious, and certain. Instead, they became part of one of history's most haunting reminders that wars are often remembered not for the victories they promised, but for the lives they consumed. More than a century has passed since the guns of Gallipoli finally fell silent, but the scars of that campaign never truly disappeared. The beaches remain quiet now, while the trenches still cut through the hillsides. Beneath the soil rests thousands of young soldiers who crossed oceans believing they were marching toward glory, only to become trapped in one of history's most devastating campaigns for Australia and New Zealand. Gallipoli became the story of sacrifice that shaped national identity for Turkey. It became the moment a future nation found its voice through the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And for the world, Gallipoli remains a warning about the cost of ambition, miscalculation, and war itself. If you enjoyed this story, there are many more forgotten moments of history waiting to be uncovered here on History Ledger. Next, we will journey into another true historical tragedy and witness the human stories hidden behind the headlines of war. So, subscribe if you have not already, and join us again for the next chapter of history. Thanks for watching.